The old woman's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the piece of bread, but she still tried. On her knees on the cold kitchen floor, she leaned forward and picked up the scraps that had just been thrown at her. Rice scattered across the tiles, a piece of dry roti half-soaked in spilled water, and the faint sound of laughter echoing behind her. "If you're that hungry," the younger woman's voice cut through the room, sharp and impatient, "then eat it like that. Don't expect to sit at my table." The old woman froze for a second, her eyes lowering even further, as if the ground itself was the only place she was allowed to exist. Slowly, painfully, she reached down again, forcing herself to eat while trying not to cry. Every movement felt heavier than the last, like her dignity was being crushed with each bite. The room felt suffocatingly quiet except for the sound of her trembling breath, and then something strange broke that silence. At first it was distant, a low, rhythmic thudding in the sky. Easy to ignore, but it grew louder and louder, until the windows began to vibrate slightly and the air itself seemed to shift. The woman standing over her frowned, glancing toward the door, irritated by the noise, but the old woman, she paused just for a moment, as if she recognized that sound. As if for the first time in a long time something had finally arrived for her. No one in that house ever really saw her as a person anymore. To them, she was just there. A fragile, slow-moving burden who took up space, needed care, and gave nothing in return. She lived in the smallest room at the back of the house, a place that barely got sunlight, with walls that seemed to close in a little more each day. She spoke very little, not because she couldn't, but because she had learned that her words carried no weight. Meals were not shared with her, they were given to her, often late, often cold, sometimes not at all unless she asked, and even then asking came with consequences. The woman who controlled the house, her daughter-in-law, made sure of that. She was efficient, organized, and outwardly respectable to everyone else, but inside those walls her patience ran thin, and her kindness ran even thinner. To her, the old woman was a constant reminder of responsibility she never wanted, a problem she couldn't get rid of. And over time, that quiet resentment turned into something colder, something sharper, but there was something about the old woman that didn't quite fit the image they had created of her. She never begged, never argued, never tried to defend herself. Even in humiliation, there was a strange kind of restraint in her posture, like she had once lived a life where she didn't have to ask for anything. Sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she would sit a little straighter, her eyes distant, as if remembering something far beyond those walls. There was an old ring she never took off, worn and faded but clearly once valuable. And a small, locked box tucked away beneath her bed that no one had bothered to open, because no one believed it could hold anything worth their time. To everyone else, she was just a forgotten woman at the end of her life, but the truth was, no one had ever asked who she was before she became this silent figure on the kitchen floor. And as the sound of that helicopter grew louder outside, one thing was about to become painfully clear: they had made a mistake judging her, a very big one. Every day followed the same quiet, painful pattern, as if the house itself had learned how to ignore her existence. She woke up before everyone else, not because she wanted to, but because sleep rarely stayed with her for long. The thin mattress beneath her offered no comfort, and the silence of her small room felt heavier than any noise. By the time the rest of the house stirred, she had already folded her blanket, washed her face with cold water, and taken her place in the corner of the kitchen, never in the way. Never noticed unless she was needed or, more often, blamed. Breakfast was never truly hers. If anything was left after everyone else had eaten, it would be pushed toward her without a word. Sometimes it was stale bread, sometimes half-finished plates, and sometimes nothing at all. On those days, she simply drank water and told herself it was enough. The daughter-in-law ran the house with strict control. To outsiders, she appeared responsible, even admirable, but inside her tone changed. Her words carried an edge that cut deeper each time. Small mistakes, walking too slowly, spilling a drop of water, forgetting to close a cupboard, were met with sharp criticism. "You're always in the way," she would say, "or at your age you should at least know how to sit quietly." And the old woman did exactly that. She made herself smaller with every passing day, shrinking into silence as if it were the only safe place left. The worst moments came in the kitchen. Food, something so basic, became a tool of control. There were times when a plate would be placed on the counter just out of her reach, only for it to be knocked down moments later with an annoyed sigh. If you can't even hold it properly, then eat it from there, the daughter-in-law would snap, and so she did. Slowly, painfully, she bent down, her joints protesting, her dignity already shattered long ago. But beneath that fragile exterior, there were things that didn't quite belong to the life she seemed to be living now. Small, almost invisible details that didn't match the image of a helpless, forgotten woman. Her posture, even when weakened, carried a strange sense of discipline. The way she folded her blanket each morning was precise, almost practiced. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words were clear, measured, and carried a quiet authority that didn't go unnoticed, at least not by everyone. A delivery man once paused longer than usual, watching her as she thanked him with a slight nod. Later, he mentioned to someone outside, "She doesn't seem like someone who's always lived like this." But inside the house, those observations meant nothing. There was also the ring. Old, slightly worn, but unmistakably valuable to anyone who paid attention. It never left her finger, even when everything else had been taken from her. Once the daughter-in-law had tried to remove it while she slept, her curiosity sparked by its weight and design, but the old woman had woken instantly, pulling her hand back with surprising strength. It was the only time anyone had seen a flicker of resistance in her eyes. After that, no one tried again, and then there was the small locked box under her bed. Covered in dust, ignored by everyone, dismissed as worthless. But sometimes, late at night, she would take it out and hold it close, not opening it. Just resting her hands on it, as if it contained something far more valuable than anyone in that house could understand. The tension reached its peak on a day that started no differently than the others. The house was busy, voices moving in and out, footsteps echoing through the halls. Guests had arrived, and the daughter-in-law was determined to present everything perfectly. The old woman stayed out of sight, as always, until she was called into the kitchen. A plate was placed in her hands, heavier than usual, piled with leftovers from the guest's meal. For a moment it almost seemed like an act of kindness, but then, just as quickly, it was gone. The plate slipped or perhaps was pushed and crashed onto the floor, food scattering across the tiles. The room went silent for a second, all eyes turning toward her. "Look at what you've done now," the daughter-in-law said loudly, her voice laced with embarrassment and anger. "If you want to eat, then eat it from there. Don't make a scene in front of everyone." This time there were witnesses, and yet no one stepped forward. The old woman looked down at the mess, her hands trembling more than usual. Slowly she lowered herself to the floor. Each movement seemed heavier, more painful, as if her body was finally giving in to everything it had endured. She reached for the food, her vision blurring, her breath uneven. For a moment it looked like she might collapse completely, and then, just as the silence became unbearable, a sound broke through it. Deep, loud, unmistakable, a helicopter. At first it was distant, like a passing distraction, but within seconds it grew louder, closer, impossible to ignore. The windows began to rattle, the air shifting with the force of it. Everyone in the house froze, confusion replacing the earlier tension. "What is that?" someone whispered. The daughter-in-law frowned, irritated again, moving toward the door. Outside, the wind from the blades whipped through the yard, dust rising into the air as the helicopter descended. It wasn't something that belonged in their world, not here, not for them. Before anyone could process it, the helicopter landed nearby, and within moments the door burst open. Men in formal attire, accompanied by uniformed security, stepped inside with urgency and purpose. Their presence alone changed the atmosphere instantly. "We're looking for her," one of them said, his voice firm but controlled. He spoke a full name, clear, precise, carrying weight, a name no one in that house had ever used. The room fell into stunned silence. The old woman, still on the floor, slowly lifted her head. For the first time there was recognition in her eyes. The men moved toward her immediately, their expressions shifting from urgency to shock as they took in her condition. One of them knelt beside her, his voice softening. "Ma'am, we've been searching for you everywhere." The respect in his tone was undeniable. Careful hands helped her to her feet, treating her with a level of dignity no one in that house had ever shown. The daughter-in-law stood frozen, her mind struggling to catch up with what was happening. "There must be some mistake," she said quickly, her voice no longer confident. But she couldn't finish the sentence, because in that moment it became painfully clear that the woman she had treated as nothing was far from it. The power in the room shifted completely. The same people who had ignored her now stepped back, unsure, uncomfortable, suddenly aware of their own actions. The officials exchanged glances, their expressions hardening as they looked around the house, taking in every detail. They didn't need explanations, the truth was already visible. And as the old woman stood there, supported but steady, she didn't look at anyone with anger. She didn't shout, she didn't accuse. That silence, the same silence they had once dismissed, now carried something far heavier. The daughter-in-law tried to speak again, her voice smaller now, uncertain, but no words came out. Because some moments don't need confrontation to deliver consequences. Sometimes the truth arriving is enough. No one spoke as she was guided toward the door. The same house that once felt so controlled, so certain of its rules and power, now stood completely still, like it was holding its breath. The old woman walked slowly but not weakly. There was a quiet steadiness in her steps now, something that hadn't been visible before, as if she had been carrying it inside her all along, just waiting for the moment it could finally exist again. The people who had rushed in treated her with care, adjusting their pace to match hers, one of them shielding her from the harsh wind outside as the helicopter blades continued to spin. She paused only once, just at the edge of the doorway, not to look back at the house but to take a breath, a long, quiet breath that seemed to carry years of silence with it. For a second it felt like she might say something, like she might turn around and finally speak all the words she had swallowed for so long, but she didn't. She simply closed her eyes briefly, then stepped forward. Behind her, everything she left behind felt smaller than it had ever been. The daughter-in-law stood frozen in place, her mind racing, trying to grasp how everything had slipped out of her control so quickly. Just minutes ago she had felt powerful, justified, certain of her place. Now she couldn't even meet anyone's eyes. The same people who had once stayed silent now looked at her differently, not with fear but with something colder. Judgment, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. She opened her mouth once as if to explain, to defend herself, to somehow fix what had already been exposed, but the words never came. Because deep down, she knew there was nothing she could say that would change what had already been seen. Outside, the sound of the helicopter grew louder again as the old woman was carefully helped inside, and then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, it began to lift off. The wind it created swept across the ground, brushing against the walls of the house, through the open door, across the same kitchen floor where she had once been forced to kneel. For a brief moment it was as if that space itself was being wiped clean, like a silent reminder of everything that had happened there, and then it was gone. The noise faded, the air settled. But the silence it left behind felt heavier than anything before it, because some lessons don't come with warnings, they arrive all at once, undeniable and irreversible. And sometimes the person you choose to look down on, to dismiss, to treat as if they are nothing, turns out to be the one who reveals exactly who you are, not through revenge, not through anger, but through truth.